Colonel Watkins, welcome to my show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Colonel, a few weeks ago, I encountered one of your interview, which is one with Redacted, and ever since that, I've been on a roll watching your videos non-stop. I think I've watched more than 20 hours of your videos already, and I find your work to be very interesting. So, can you explain a little bit about the Operation Gladio, and you were claiming that it is still relevant until today? Maybe you can explain a little bit to my audience.
Okay. So, just a little bit of background on myself. I spent 30 years in the Air Force and lived all over the world. I've traveled to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. I was stationed in Italy. And so I feel, and plus, I went to school most of my adult life. I have 6 different degrees, and I have a very large repertoire of history under my belt. And so about 3 years ago, I was reading several books that kind of rocked my world in what I thought was kind of proven history as it's been taught to me. And basically, the premise of what I was reading is that there's this structure that exists in the world. I call it the international syndicate because it runs like a criminal mafia system. And they set up after World War II all of the intelligence agencies around the world. The KCIA in Korea, the CIA in the United States, Mossad in Israel, and the BND in Germany. And you can view these intelligence agencies not working necessarily for their governments, but for the syndicate. And the interesting part of that was the people that are in this, the corporations and people that are in the syndicate use the intelligence agencies, kind of what has classically been called the Praetorian Guard. So their idea, born from the Fabian Society in the late 1800s, was we're going to have one world government. And it doesn't matter what the people of the world care about that. That's what they're going to do. And they will destabilize any country to gain access to the resources. And how do they do that? Well, if you go back to World War II, before the war was even over, there was a meeting in northern Italy between Alan Dulles, who goes on to be the CIA director, and on the American side, a major general called Lyman Lemmesker. And they met with a General Wolf on the Nazi side. And there was a couple of other Nazis present in the room at the time. And they decided that they were going to make a deal among themselves outside of the federal government in the United States and what was being decided between the Allies, which at the time was the Soviet Union, Churchill in England, and Roosevelt, and then Truman towards the end in the United States. Their deal was there was an apparatus that Hitler had set up. The nickname of them was called werewolf units, but what they were, in fact, were stay behind units. And a stay behind unit was defined as a group of 15 to 20 individuals that were civilians, and they would have a cache of weapons that was supplied by Hitler and Reinhard Gehlen in the Eastern Front. And we'll talk about just the Eastern Front. There was a corresponding Western Front initiative as well, but I concentrate on Reinhard Gehlen because he goes on to be installed as West Germany's first CIA counterpart in the BND. So Reinhard Gehlen and his trainer was Otto Skorzeny. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Nazi military. They went behind the Eastern Front, behind Hitler's troops, into the Soviet Union. And they were planting these stay behind units using civilians in caches of weapons. And the thought was that if the Eastern Front was to collapse, that they would spring up these stay behind units on the rear of the Soviets and attack them. They were given explosives, they were given ammunition, they were given comm equipment. Well, this whole apparatus was not only on the Eastern Front, but in France and in the Netherlands. So General Wolfe came to this meeting and said, if you spare us, and here's my list of people that we want rat-lined out of Germany.
Mhm.
If you do that, we will make a deal with you and we will turn over this list of all this. I mean, it was huge. This entire stay behind network, and you can use them. So
Uh,
Alan,
when you say if you save us, I believe these people are connected to the Nazis, right?
they're all Nazis at
Oh,
this point.
they're not Nazis. Okay.
They're all Nazis.
Okay.
So, and they're in Romania, they're in Hungary, they're in what we now call Ukraine. And that's where the current day Azov's roots go back to. So the Nazis that are in Ukraine today that Putin keeps talking about are real. They're not made up. They literally hold up Bandera, Stetsko, and all of these Nazi stay behind unit leaders as their, kind of like our George Washington. That's the way they think of their past. They're true. They're not neo Nazis. They're true life Nazis. And so, because as I'm exploring this topic, I'm seeing the modern day versions of it play out. I'm like, holy crap! That explains Putin's comment about denazifying Ukraine. It's real. It isn't made up. And here is the foundation of it. And so the more I got to looking into it, and Lyman Lemmitzkers, who at the time was a two-star general, his role in all of this was so fascinating to me because, of course, I'm military. And he was General Eisenhower's chief logistics officer. Now, for your audience, may or may not know what logistics is. It's moving stuff around on the battlefield.
Yeah.
He's in charge of supplying all the weaponries to the different Army corps, brigades, and moving everything around. The whole supply network is under his command. So the guy that is in charge of weapons is at a meeting with Alan Dulles to agree to set up these. So again, if you're going to supply these stay behind units who currently has Nazi weapons, you would want the supply guy there sitting next to you because they're going to have to change out all of the weaponry to be the new NATO weaponry, right? Because you can't have these stay behind units actually using old German armaments. And so the war ends and NATO gets stood up. And NATO takes over. There's two elements of NATO. One was called the ACC, the Allied Clandestine Committee. Another one was called the CPC, Clandestine Planning Committee. So these two elements are covert elements of NATO. And the Marshall Plan gets stood up. And most people don't realize there was actually kind of what we would call a secret or a covert element of funding in the Marshall Plan that went to this operation.
Wow.
And so you have this entire network throughout Europe. As everybody gets back to normal business, this network is there. And originally, the conversation was around, well, we have to have this because the Soviet Union is going to come over the Volga Gap any minute. They're going to attack Europe. Well, they had already lost 25 million people. The Soviet Union had been destroyed by the Nazis in their push into the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union in the immediate aftermath of World War II around 1945 was not a threat to anyone. But they used that and started the narrative. And then you have Churchill coming to the United States talking about the Iron Curtain, the Cold War, and using those types of terminologies so that you see the seeding of a narrative that the country, the Soviet Union, that was just our ally, is now our enemy.
Mm.
And you have to have in this, they use the term strategy of tension. You have to have an enemy in order to justify what we did in the aftermath of World War II. And what did we do? We, for the first time ever in the United States, had a standing military. We didn't go back and demobilize. We constituted a military industrial complex that was going to outlive all of us. And if you're going to maintain a military industrial complex, you have to have wars. They're not just going to do this for the fun of it. And Americans are not going to pay taxes to sustain a standing military, which we had never had before, if there's not a threat. So you create the threat. And so they created this threat
So now
of,
you were saying standing military. Can you explain that a little bit? Prior to that,
so
America didn't have a military, what do we call, like, doesn't have a military force or something like that?
so we had what prior to World War II. So we had, several years before that, a couple of decades, we had World War I.
Mhm.
When World War I was over, the people came home and got other jobs. They
Oh,
didn't stay in the military.
oh,
And the money that was made during World War I was very lucrative. And so the thought was, did we have a Department of War? Yes, we did. Did we have planning people? Yes. But it was a very, compared to what we have today, it was a very small cadre of people that was in charge. And we had National Guard, the part-time military in all of the states. And so they were responsible for dictating the training level of all of these people and to maintain war plans on how to transition the United States to a war footing if ever needed, which is exactly what happened in World War II. So we went from this very small cadre in the 1930s of professional military people to millions during World War II, and they never went home after World War II. We decided after World War II that this communist threat from a country, because China, of course, had not, I mean, it was still a backwoods country at the time. Um, the and at that point, Mao had not even kind of got his footing. They were still Chiang Kai-shek and the warlords in the South were still fighting him. So they're not a threat to us, but you have to have a threat if you're going to justify maintaining all of these people on active duty as a warfighting capability. So um, so that happened, and then we stood up the Central Intelligence Agency, and they never went away. Even after the fall of the Soviet Union, we didn't downsize our military. This NATO didn't go away. There's just because in 1991, when the Soviet Union went away, what rose in its place? The Islamic terrorist threat.
mhm.
And if you trace the roots of this Islamic terrorist threat, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, Al Qaeda, they're all created by the UK and the United States intelligence. The Muslim Brotherhood at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, was actually created by the UK, England, in order to control Egypt because they had the Suez Canal. And so, in order to be able to control the internal operations of a country, you have to have this secret network. And that's what gave birth to the Muslim Brotherhood. The same thing with Hamas. Israel created Hamas to control the PLO. They funded it initially.
Mm.
So you have all of these, and the term that people use in describing this entire operation, or the placement of these entities, is called a strategy of tension. So in a strategy of tension, you create your own enemy because you want to control it. And you have that entity, which is what the whole Stay Behind network was all about. It was never about fighting communism. That was just an excuse. The Stay Behind units in Europe and in the United States, because all NATO countries had to sign an agreement that they would create their own stay-behind networks in their countries to control events. And so what they did in the first application of documented of a stay behind unit network was in 1948 in the election of in Italy. The United States poured $35 million in 1948 dollars. That's a fortune into deciding the election in Italy because you had one person running that, of course, the CIA called communist. Although they were not communists, they were very much workers' rights. They were interested in giving the power back to the people. And then you had one guy running that was very pro joining NATO, getting Italy into NATO. And of course, the NATO lover won because the entire election was manipulated. And what they use the stay behind units for is terrorism, domestic terrorism. And they will have dressed up as, in Italy's case, the Red Brigade, because that was their communist. They would have them pull off domestic terror events to scare the people. And anytime you have a domestic terror event, the fallback is look to government for your safety. And so you have this creep of government agencies under the protection of the people, like we had after 9/11. Right? We stood up Homeland Security. We implemented the Patriot Act. And basically what it was is Americans giving our freedom away to the government in exchange for them keeping us protected. We stood up the TSA where they pat you down and x-ray you every time you want to get on an airplane and collect all of your data.
Really?
And so,
I mean, I've never been to America, but if you want to go on a plane, you have to go through X-ray and so on.
yes,
Oh, okay.
yes, they literally
Or you
have
mean like X-ray as in looking if there's anything, any weapons and so
yes.
on? Oh, okay. That's I think it's happening here too.
Yeah. And so people are willing to give up. They found this to be true. When you create domestic terror events, people are willing to give up their safety in order for the government's protection in exchange. But the government's never been about protecting us. They could care less about us. It just creates a bigger government. And with bigger government comes more surveillance and more control. And if you're going to, at the end of the day, create one world government, you have to be able to control all the people.
Mhm.
And so it's a self-licking ice cream cone for them. And so I started digging into this whole stay behind concept because for me in the military, having gone to, years and years of professional military education, I had never heard of a stay behind unit.
Mhm.
It never came up. I spent a year at a thing called Air War College, which at the end of it, you get a master's degree. You're supposed to be an expert in world affairs and political systems and warfighting capability and all this other stuff. And the stay behind unit concept has been used all over the world since World War II. And not 1 minute was spent on anything to do with it. And so I just found that fascinating. I'm like, what? They're hiding this from us intellectually. It is something that they've used over and over and over again to control governments, and it never came up in professional military education on how the world works. I found it fascinating. So, of course, being the person that I am, I wanted to know everything about it. So I found out you may or may not know that in 1953 we overthrew the government of Iran, and for your audience that doesn't know the history there, the Shah had been kind of put out to pasture, if you will, because they wanted to have an election. And they had kind of a prime minister type system in Iran. And so Mossadegh ended up being the prime minister. And Aramco, the oil entity in Saudi Arabia, had just renegotiated with Standard Oil a new contract that kind of divvied up the proceeds 50-50. And in Iran, their agreement was with what eventually becomes BP in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And so Mossadegh is looking at educating and wanting to set up hospitals and do everything the Shah had never done before throughout the entire country of Iran. His concession with the UK at the time was 86.14. So they got 14 cents of every dollar of profit generated from their own oil. And
You
he
mean
said
like
that's not.
Iran 14 and the UK 86%.
Yes, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and the Shah was perfectly fine with that because he didn't do any of the stuff Mossadegh wanted to do. He didn't care if the people of Iran ate or not. He didn't care if they had hospitals. He didn't care if they were educated. He literally didn't care. His 14 cents of every dollar kept him and the elite in Iran perfectly satisfied. So Mossadegh gets in office, and it was the first democratic election Iran had ever in their history.
Oh,
And so he says that he approaches the UK and says, okay, I want the deal that Aramco got. I want 50-50. And the UK said, absolutely not. We're not going to do it. So the people in Iran decide they're going to strike and support their president or their prime minister. And Mossadegh was very adamant. He says, I cannot feed and educate and care for the people of Iran on 14 cents. I just can't do it. So the UK tried to coup him. They tried to overthrow his government. Well, they failed. So the UK MI6 picks up the phone and calls Alan Dulles in. I'm not sure if he was actually in at the time. They called the CIA and they said, okay, we can't do it. We failed. And he kicked us out of the country. He literally kicked all of the British out of the country. And he said, so we're going to need you to do it for us. And here's the deal. Standard Oil, if you can convince the CIA, and keep in mind that Alan Dulles and his brother, John Foster Dulles, did work for Standard Oil out of their law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. And so they collectively decide that the United States, the CIA, is going to go over there and overthrow the government. And the guy they picked to lead it was a guy by the name of Kermit Roosevelt. He was Teddy Roosevelt's grandson.
mm.
Yeah. So Kermit Roosevelt goes over there, and in the build up to the overthrow, they create stay-behinds. They create stay-behind units of tribes in the south of Iran. They train them to be terrorists. They train them how to kill people, how to stage events inside of Iran under the control of the CIA. So all of the people that were out in the streets during the coup were paid operatives of the CIA. So
Wow.
they overthrew Mossadegh. He lives under house arrest for the rest of his life. He never knows freedom or anything else. And they reinstall the Shah. And of course, we know most of the history after that. But this is indicative of how this machine operates. We did the exact same thing in Guatemala the next year. And what were we doing in Guatemala? Well, there's another oligarch of this international syndicate that it was called United Fruit. And United Fruit had basically bought up all of the farmland in Guatemala that you could farm on. They through corrupt land deals. They basically had a lock on all of Guatemala. And they had a democratically elected president come to power that wanted the people to have their land back. He was not part of the elite there. He got elected in a real election, and the CIA immediately labels him in his dispute with United Fruit a communist. There's literally no documentation of him even communicating with the Soviet Union. None.
Wow.
And so, but in the United States, all of the media was, oh my God, we've got this communist in our hemisphere. We can't have that. And so Arbenz goes to United Fruit and he says, okay, you have all of this land and you've been valuing it at $1 million. You've been paying taxes on it with the value of $1 million. Over the next so many years, I'm going to pay you $1 million for the land, but we want it back and we want you out. And United Fruit says we're not leaving. So, and then they tell him, we want $20 million. And Arbenz was kind of like, then you owe me back taxes. If you're telling me it's worth $20 million, how come you haven't been paying taxes on $20 million? Mm-hmm. And so basically, he tries to kick United Fruit out. Well, do you know what law firm represented United Fruit? Sullivan and Cromwell.
Wow.
And so they just pick up the phone and they go, hey, we need Arbenz out of office. And we went down there and threw him out of office in a coup and installed a military dictator. And this military dictator then went for everybody that voted for Arbenz, they just start mass killing them. Any of the leaders, any of the union leads, any of them, there's just mass slaughter. And so when you start looking at history through the eyes of Operation Gladio and how these coups operate, they're always done on behalf of someone in the international syndicate, whether they want the copper, as it was in the case in Chile, or whether they want to use the property to grow drugs. And then you have to ask yourself, since most of this is done covertly without appropriated funds, how they get the money. Well, if you go back to the immediate aftermath of World War II, you have to look in China. There's this entire group of OSS agents that had operated in China in support of Chiang Kai-shek, one of the opium warlords that was fighting Mao. And so Chiang Kai-shek had this entire apparatus of military called the KMT, named after the area in which they occupied in southern China. And so notorious people like Paul Helliwell, who was a member of the OSS, he's watching Chiang Kai-shek not only fight the Japanese, but also fight Mao. And he's doing it off the proceeds of selling opium. And so Paul Helliwell talks to Alan Dulles and he goes, this Gladio thing that you're trying to set up and fund covertly, I've got the perfect way to fund it covertly. Let's sell drugs. And all we have to do is protect Chiang Kai-shek because he's the master at it. And so Mao obviously eventually kicked Chiang Kai-shek out of China. And where does he go? He goes to Burma. And they set up Chiang Kai-shek and his KMT army in Burma initially. Well, the Burmese government gets sick of having all of the garbage going on. And you have an entire almost autonomous area of northern Burma that the Burmese government couldn't get control of. And that's where they plopped Chiang Kai-shek down in. And so eventually the Burmese government says, yeah, no, he's got to go. There's just too much crap going on up there. And so they go over to an island called Formosa off the coast of China, and they plop Chiang Kai-shek down there. And Formosa changes its name to Taiwan, like literally overnight. And it's a Chinese island occupied by a Chinese general, Chiang Kai-shek. And immediately, General MacArthur comes to the United States and testifies in front of Congress and says, it's the perfect democracy. Chiang Kai-shek is the president. Mm-hmm. Well, if you know the history of Formosa, there was a lot of Formosans who had just been under Japanese occupation. They didn't want Chiang Kai-shek as president. They wanted an election. They wanted to run their own island. And they were vehemently opposed to Chiang Kai-shek. And so they started rabble-rousing, going, no, get this guy out of here. We don't want the opium. We don't want any of that crap here. Well, Chiang Kai-shek immediately declares martial law. He lives, the Formosans live under martial law for the next 40 years with either Chiang Kai-shek or his son in charge. And they create the world's largest opium network around the world, all being managed out of Taiwan. And that floored me. I had never heard that history. I didn't know anything about it. And again, I have a whole lot of history under my belt. And I'm like, this cannot be true. But the more I read about it, I'm like, holy crap, it is true. And you find people like a guy by the name of William Polly. William Polly was a millionaire in the United States. He eventually goes on to be an ambassador. And he's in the Southeast area.
Mhm.
He is a representative. He has a franchise of Curtiss Aircraft. Curtiss Aircraft produced both fighters and normal cargo aircraft. And he was responsible for ensuring that Chiang Kai-shek had an air force. And Paul Helliwell created a CIA front company called Sea Supply. He was responsible for giving the Navy to Chiang Kai-shek in order to get all the drugs moved around. And they basically set up shop in Thailand. The CIA would go on to supply $35 million to the Thailand's National Guard, National Police Force that was trained by the CIA. And they basically, for the $35 million, got free access to all seaports and all airports with no customs, no anything.
Wow.
So Thailand becomes this big thoroughfare for opium. And they buy off all of the officials and all of this stuff. And a few coups along the way of Thailand, getting rid of the people who don't want to support these operations comes with part of this whole deal. And they created this entity called the Office of Public Safety in USAID. Now, it had existed before, but USAID, when it was kind of all glommed in together, it used to be called AID, and then it was called USAID. Um, excuse me, under Kennedy, they set up a thing called the Office of Public Safety. And the Office of Public Safety's job was to go in and train the national police forces all over the world, like 100 different countries. And you have USAID basically served as a front for CIA all over the world. And the Office of Public Safety is definitely an Orwellian name, because basically what they taught the national police to do was how to control dissidents. If anybody rises up against these military installed dictators, you are to kidnap them, you are to torture them to get information about their neighbors out of them, and then they just disappear.
Wow.
And they coined the word disappearing, because they just would bury you in, graves. Or in the case of Argentina, when they overthrew Argentina's government, they killed so many people that they load them up in airplanes and fly them out over the water and dump them. And
My
this was all done under the guise of an office called public safety.
wow. Lots of stuff to unpack there, but um, um, I want to go back to the Middle East, in which you said that the US actually funded or created many of these terrorist groups like Hamas and so on. Like, I've heard of that many times before, but I've never could find a smoking gun where, people were saying Benjamin Netanyahu or the state of Israel was funding Hamas and so on. But I could never find the smoking gun that proved they actually did it. Is there like a document or something like that that absolutely prove he was responsible for funding
It's
Hamas?
actually written in newspapers in Israel.
Oh, wow.
The person that you want to, the expert on that is a guy on X called the Ghost of Base Patrick Henry. He's literally an expert in it. And he produces all of the source documents that document all of it. He's also, I had already traced the Muslim Brotherhood creation by the Brits in Egypt, but he's dug so much deeper into all of it. I'm more of the 30,000 foot. I work with him a lot on all of this. He's the guy that goes below the surface and gets all of the documentations. And he has video after video on Rumble. He's a contributor over at Badlands Media. And if you just go to any of his material over there, there's mountains of it documenting every bit of it.
Mhm. I will check it out. But, Colonel, I was just wondering, what is your view on Saddam Hussein? I've seen your interview previously. You were saying that he was a US puppet, but I was just wondering if he was a US puppet, then why did they want him out?
So that's an interesting question, and it confuses a lot of people.
Mhm,
And you can look at Noriega in Panama, and they did the same thing to him. Everyone knew that Noriega was on the CIA payroll,
mhm,
um, and they become not useful to them anymore. So
oh,
as a matter of fact, the CIA is so good at this that they are grooming any of their puppets that they have in place. They're grooming the replacement for
mm,
because most of the puppets that they have, they've figured out over time, grow to such importance because they're heads of state that they actually think they can do business on the side
mm,
and that they're untouchable because they have so much crap on the CIA for being their puppet. You know, they're collecting stuff too. So you can't, in most cases, allow those people to talk.
mhm,
And so, in the case of Saddam Hussein, um, obviously we overthrew the government. Saddam Hussein is placed in charge, and he's basically, and this is just a fascinating story with him specifically because of how my path crossed into this story.
mhm,
Um, so I didn't know any of this stuff when I was on active duty. I arrived in Rome, Italy, for a 3-year assignment in Italy on the 2nd of August, 1990. What I didn't know was also going on that exact date is Prime Minister Andreotti, the guy that was in charge of Italy at the time, was briefing the Senate on the fact because there had been a prosecutor in Italy that somehow managed to stay alive because most of them were killed if they started looking into Operation Gladio. He had went to Andreotti and said, "Look, I've got all the evidence. We know Operation Gladio is real, even though you've tried to keep it covert all this entire time." So Andreotti goes to the Senate on the 2nd of July of uh, 1990 and basically spills his guts and says, "Yeah, it's real." He doesn't tell him all about it, but he does acknowledge it. So 2nd of August, sorry. And so that is the very day that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait.
mhm,
So when I got to Italy, which I didn't realize at the time, anytime this stuff boils up, one of the favorite domestic terror attacks is the Rome airport because there's lots of people in it. And so they had on the 2nd of August, when I arrived, they had like for every passenger in the international terminal, like 5 carabinieri guys with AK-47s when I got off the airplane. And I'm like, what the heck? I'd never seen like AK-47 gun toting people at an airport ever.
yeah,
And I'm like, what did I do? I don't know if I want to be here. And so, of course, later on, I find out like the next day what had happened. And so the week before that, in the lead up to Andreotti spilling the beans, now you have to understand that Andreotti would have been in communications with NATO's planning centers that I explained at the early part of the show, and telling them, I'm going to have to admit to some part of this. And so there had to have been collaboration to exactly what extent he was going to admit that it existed because it's controlled out of NATO.
mm,
And so the week before, April Gillespie, who was she wasn't the ambassador, but she's like the consul in Iraq to Saddam Hussein, told Saddam Hussein, you are free to go do whatever you want with Kuwait
Mhm.
for them stealing your oil. She gives him permission because what they're going to do is they're going to hide the exposure of Operation Gladio in Italy behind the war in Iraq, Desert Storm.
Mhm.
So we're going to have this deflective war over here and invade Iraq, but we're going to leave Saddam Hussein there.
Mhm.
And so, in the aftermath of the revelation of Operation Gladio in Italy actually being a real thing, um, Andreotti comes out a couple of days later and tells the country of Italy, yeah, we did this. We're sorry. We shouldn't have done it. So immediately throughout Europe, there's this clamor to all of the other countries. Hey, are you doing this to us? Are you doing this to us? Are you doing this to us? All over Europe.
Uh-huh.
And of course, all of the other heads of state go, we have no idea. We would certainly never do anything like that. And so, and in addition to that, they're saying, don't bother us with this petty question right now because we're getting ready to go to war with the United States. You know, so they have a convenient story to say we're real busy right now. Um, and so October comes and they have another meeting at NATO of Operation Gladio at the ACC and the CPC. So they host a meeting. All of the NATO countries shows up at this meeting. And Andreotti is sitting there going, well, wait a minute. You guys are going to let me swing here? You're going to pretend like you're not doing it too? So he goes back to the public in Italy and says, here's the list of countries that just attended a Gladio meeting. They're all in on it. And so then it goes, you know, kind of for a little bit of time, very mainstream. And all of the countries had it. Turkey had it. It was called Grey Wolves. Portugal had it. Theirs was called a Genter Press. And so everybody had some version to include Sweden, Norway, and Finland. They even had them, and they weren't even in NATO. And William Casey, the guy that goes on to be the CIA director in the immediate aftermath of World War II, set them all up there. They
Wow.
were literally everywhere in Europe. And they were on call to do any domestic terror event they needed in order to either change the subject or pass legislation or get rid of an inconvenient politician or whatever. So there's a guy by the name, his last name was Mattei. He was in charge of Italy's oil and gas. And he too was one of those 50-50 guys. He believed that 50% of the profit should stay in the country of origin. And so he flies over to Libya, which was a big source of oil for Italy at the time. And he's renegotiating on behalf of Italy the contract with Libya.
Mhm.
On his way back, his plane blows up.
Wow.
So they said it was mechanical failure. And for years, that was the story. It just was unfortunate. His plane blew up. Well, after Gladio gets revealed in 1990, they dig this man's body up and examine his gold ring, and it has explosives embedded in the ring.
Wow.
And they realize that he was sabotaged and killed.
Mhm. Okay. I was just wondering, how do they keep this stay behind unit? How did they keep these people loyal for decades? I mean, like, do they constantly pay these people? Do they pay them monthly salary, something like that?
I have never found any actual payments. So they appeal to people's patriotism. They tell them that you're doing this. And initially, when they're being trained, initially, they believe that it's all for fighting communism. That's the story. And that's why it's so important that they label these factions communist. And you see it today. You know, the labeling of President Trump as a Nazi, or the labels are so important to motivate people to do bad things. And the CIA is notorious for making shit up and labeling people in order to activate these people to do bad things. So if you have brainwashed these people or indoctrinated them or whatever, excuse me, whatever you want to say, to believe that communism is a threat, and that if you label someone a communist sympathizer and you say they have to be taken out, or you say a bank is transacting sneaking covert money to the Communist Party, so it's a legitimate target. They just go do it out of the dedication to fight communism.
Mhm. I understand. Um, how about Venezuela? What is your opinion on why do I mean I don't understand why they want Venezuela out so badly. Obviously, it's I don't think it's about the oil because I feel like the US has more oil than they need already. You know, the US one of the largest oil producer in 2025. So,
It literally has nothing to do with that.
uh,
And I'm not saying that we don't want, or the oligarchs, I should say, don't want Venezuela for their oil. Um, they definitely want Venezuela for its oil. Because what most people don't understand is it has nothing to do with what we have.
mm,
It's what we want. We want control over all of and I don't mean we as in the American people, because most Americans don't even know this is going on.
mm,
The oligarchs in charge, the people that run Exxon, the people that run all of the international companies, they want to control the world. That's literally their end state, one world government. If you go against them and you've kicked out their CIA operatives, their USAID operatives, you will be attacked. No questions asked. You are not allowed to be neutral. Just look at Indonesia. When we overthrew the government of Indonesia, we had already tried once when Suharto was running Indonesia, um, and that attempt failed. Indonesia had oil, and they had literally a mountain of gold, and it had been found in the 1930s. But the operation to remove Suharto in control, and your logic would be that too. Why would the United States want to overthrow a democratically elected president of Indonesia if we have all the oil we want? It's not about oil. It's about control. Suharto was one of the non-aligned leaders. He was promoting other countries, specifically in Africa, to stop being extorted and allow their natural resources to go out pennies on the dollar out of their country and to benefit their own people from their resources. So he had to go, and he went. And in its place, the guy that the CIA installed was a dictator of the worst kind, and 1 million people died.
wow.
And they don't care. They don't care about human life. They don't care how many people die. They want the resources, and they want to control all of them.
But at the same time, I was just wondering why some countries are allowed to utilize their resources and some of them did become rich. Some are, even if they toe the line, they didn't become as rich as some countries. Like, for example, I'm from Malaysia. I feel like I could be wrong, but I feel like we are being allowed to develop our industries, our natural resources to a large extent, at least. Is that, I mean, like, does the US or what do you call the Operation Gladio, the intelligence agencies and so on, they have specific countries where they want that country to become strong, for example.
I would suggest to you that the reason why Malaysia, so just through my research, obviously you're more of an expert in Malaysia than I am, but just from my research, Malaysia has always been aligned with the UK in some extent. So if you're already, and I'm going to use this word, even if it's offensive, compliant with this network, and they know they can rely on you, then you're given much more autonomy than if you are steadfastly opposed to them. And you will not allow them to use USAID in your country. You will not allow them to infiltrate your labor unions. If you put a dead stop on that, you will be targeted. So I was shocked to know that all of the stuff that we did in Vietnam, the UK did a few years before that in Malaysia.
Oh,
They had used Agent Orange on people. They had did all kinds of atrocious things in Malaysia that was copied in Vietnam. The rounding up of people, dissidents that were opposed to the UK's role in Malaysia. I was shocked by that actually. I'd never read about any of that. And
I know
so
what is that timeline because this is brand new information for me. You're educating me.
So it would have been like in the 1950s because in the 60s we were already in Vietnam.
Oh, 1950s. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know, I don't remember because I've I've read now over 150 books just on this topic.
Wow.
But the I want to say it was in Doug Valentine's book. He wrote a book called Operation Phoenix or the Phoenix Program, where he mentions a lot of the same techniques of rounding people up and tracking them and putting them in these new villages so that they could be monitored, had already happened in Malaysia.
Mm.
Um, so that was in full swing in the 60s in Vietnam. So it had to have been sometime in the 50s in Malaysia. And that's what's fascinated me about all of this is how much of our history has been suppressed, how much of our history that is out there if you search. And I would also suggest to your audience, if you have access to it, that one of the best websites that I have found is called Yandex. It's Yandex.
Mhm.
You can find, so in this particular realm of research, if you use any of the common websites like Brave or DuckDuckGo, or I've not used Google ever, but you won't find any of this information. You
Oh.
may get, if you actually have a name of an operation, you may get one or two
Mm-hmm.
things that'll pop up. But if you type the same things in Yandex, there will be pages and pages. And the beauty of Yandex is they have a built-in translator. So all you have to do is click the language at the top and you can read um, newspapers from all over the world, which I find fascinating because obviously our news in America, coming from like the Washington Post and the New York Times, I mean, they didn't even print on what was going on in Germany until like at the end of the war. So you would have known nothing about, even though you can find other newspapers around the world having reported at the same time stuff that was actually going on. And that's true specifically about this topic. They do not want you to know anything about it.
Okay. Uh, what is your opinion on Bondi Beach? It
Um,
to me like there's a lot of hanky panky going on there.
it's definitely a Gladio operation, 100%. You only look out. One of the telltale signs is what is the immediate response of the government?
Mm-hmm.
A gun grab. That was the very first thing they did.
Mm.
And that's why the United States have domestic terror events. Every single time they want
Oh,
your guns. They want your guns. They want your guns. And it doesn't matter, just like the one we had where the two National Guard people in Washington, D.C. were shot. The very first thing they said was they want our guns. And yet you do the research on that Afghanistan guy, and where did he work? Who did he work for in Afghanistan?
I
The
actually did a
CIA.
video on that.
He
I
worked
actually
for the CIA.
yeah. See,
He was trained to be an assassin and a terrorist by the CIA.
mm.
And
And
there is no doubt, even though I have no proof of it,
uh-huh.
um, there is no doubt that that man was still in contact with the CIA
Mhm.
on some basis.
And there's also I've seen a couple of posts on X where they were saying that this guy name appears on Google Trends in US, Israel, and even in
Yes.
Malaysia, surprisingly.
Yes.
So, I mean, like, it appears a couple of days before the incident, and the
Yes.
same as the Bondi Beach, I forgot the name, I'm blinking on his name, but he
Yes.
also appeared.
Yes.
Interesting. Um, how about the Brown University? I find it weird why Mossad was so quick to get involved in this.
So and most people view all of these intelligence agencies as separate entities. They are not.
Okay.
They are not separate entities. They collectively work together. Just like in the coup of President Trump, in the lead up to his inauguration, it was MI6, MI5, and the CIA that developed the Russiagate narrative. They work collectively because none of them actually work for the government. They work for this oligarch. They did not want President Trump in office. And they were going to do anything they could and everything they could to include attempted assassination to make sure the man's not in office. And that's what people have to understand is they work as a hive collectively together. And they do it for many reasons, but non-attribution is a good one. So if the CIA is behind something, using other intelligence agencies to do their dirty work allows them to say, oh my gosh, we didn't have anything to do with it, when they're sitting right beside them planning it. Nothing happens in the United States that the CIA doesn't know ahead of time, or
So you
NSA.
mean, so you mean Mossad was put there in order for the CIA to shift blame to Mossad?
They've done it before.
Oh,
Um, so I don't view them as a separate entity.
okay. Mhm. And regarding the Charlie Kirk case, I mean, like, I find it weird why Charlie Kirk is still being talked about until today. I mean, like, I wasn't expecting the his case to be talked about until 3 months later, largely thanks to Candace Owens. Do you think that this Charlie Kirk assassination happens because they need a convenient distraction? I'm starting to feel like that is the case.
I would not call it a convenient distraction.
Mm.
If you go back in history, any significant national figure that made headway into bringing um, parts of America together. You can look at MLK. MLK was about all colors, not just blacks. He wanted everybody to get along. He's assassinated. Fred Hampton lived in Chicago. He created a thing called the Rainbow Coalition. And he had what poor whites, poor blacks, and poor Hispanics in a coalition. He was murdered in his bed. Anybody that gets all of us, regardless of race, together collectively is a threat to them. They they are able to manage us by division. They instill division into every part of society, religion, race, whatever. They keep you. It's like the analogy of a boiling pot of water. If you put the frogs in there and you turn it up slowly, they don't know that they're going to die
Mhm.
until they're dead, because then the water's hot and
Mm.
they can't jump out. And so that's what they do to us. They turn up that heat slowly, slowly by division. Let's divide them by race. Let's divide them by religion. Let's divide them by, culture. Let's divide them by now the big thing is, oh, just call all the old people boomers. And we've created these generational gaps, across age barriers. So we can keep people divided constantly. Throw divisive comments about all the boomers are stupid, or, the Gen Zs are crazy, or whatever. Um, divide us by sex. And then do this screwball thing over here where there's completely sexless people, by cutting off body parts. That's what they do. And this is all done culturally to keep us divided, because their one big threat in the world is for all of us to know they're the enemy.
Got it.
And Charlie Kirk was a master of gathering people, regardless of race, religion, or anything, collectively together and imparting true information to them. He was viewed as a threat.
Mhm. Do you think his assassination is Operation Gladio?
Yes.
And why do you think so? What is the signs that you see from his case?
Well, there's, for example, what I just explained
Mm,
about his threat to them, of coalescing people together and saying uncomfortable truths.
mhm,
So, anytime you have an assassination, none of the information that we've been given um, it adds up. None of it. You cannot orchestrate an assassination um, that was orchestrated without other people being complicit.
mm,
So in history, I've never seen a single lone gunman
yep.
that ended up being actually a lone gunman ever.
Mm,
Um, when you're dealing with a national figure like that, he had security. And then, just like at Brown University, oh, all the cameras are gone, or only this camera worked, or
mm,
only that camera worked. And the fact that you had all of these other factors that no one wants to talk about or address from
mm,
a government's perspective, you're better in putting all of the information out there and letting people source that information to be true or not true than you are at covering it up. Because anytime you cover up information, you by default um, indicate that you're complicit in the operation from a government standpoint. And I understand the whole thing about taking information and prosecuting it all, but you can still use the information for prosecution if it's out there.
mm,
What they're afraid of is the outcome won't be what they want it to be if the information is out there. And that was the case with JFK's assassination, RFK's assassination, MLK's assassination. So if you just go back and look at history, not a single one of them ever ended up being a lone gunman. That was bullshit from the beginning. And history has illustrated that. There were so many factors involved in all of them. And most of those factors could have been immediately relevant if they would have put the information out and not tried to craft a narrative. So anytime they don't release the information, people now intuitively know they're crafting a message.
mhm.
Whether they are or not, that's the go to, because we don't trust our government anymore because they've lied to us consistently.
Yeah, because Candace Owens did come up with this theory that there are a lot of men in maroon shirt, which is kind of strange because it's not a natural color that men tends to choose. And then she was linking it to international military operation and so on. So I figured probably something to do with Gladio as well.
It could have been. She has put out some good information.
Mm,
Not all of her information is completely accurate.
mm,
So anytime you have someone that, no matter who it is, that is on the internet, you have to be very discerning when you're listening to the information,
mm,
and validating it yourself to the greatest extent possible. Um, do I believe her heart's in the right place? Yes, I do. And has she been right about a whole bunch of stuff? Yes, she has. I wish Candace Owens understood Operation Gladio. I think she would have a much better perspective of ferreting out true information if she actually knew the extent to which the government has been complicit. But regardless of how many times we've tried to reach out, she's one of those people that you can't. get access to. But I think it would help her out a lot in discernment of being able to have a more critical eye of information that she's receiving.
Okay. And let's talk about Syria and Assad. Why do they want Assad out so badly?
For the same thing, they wanted a pipeline through Syria. So whether you have sometimes in the you do a search of Syria and you don't find that's one of the first things I do when some trouble spot comes up or there's a coup or whatever. The very first thing I look for is what are the resources, because I understand how the oligarch international syndicate works. What are they at? Well, in the case of Syria, it wasn't oil specifically, it was oil pipelines. There has been, yeah, there had been decades, decades of delays in pipelines because Assad was very, in fact, he flew to and had a meeting with the Queen in England and said, you can put pipelines all over Syria. You cannot put any of your military to guard them. I will guard them. You can put all of them you want, but you cannot have the military here, because he knows if the military comes, so does MI6 and MI5 dressed up as British military. And he knew they did not want him in charge. They tried to coup him repeatedly. So has the CIA. So he was willing to play ball with them. He was not willing to have foreign forces on his soil. And the UK said, too bad. We're going to get our pipelines with or without you. And that's when the initial crap started happening in Syria. And it was at the end of the Biden administration, because they knew Trump was not going to go for it. They literally threw the kitchen sink at Syria. They gathered up operatives from all of these stay behind units in Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, everywhere, and said, flood in there. We've got to get Syria because we're running out of time. And that's exactly what they did.
Wow. Do you see a potential regional war in the Middle East? Because I feel like Israel has become out of control lately. And do you think they really want the greater Israel plan is really real in your opinion?
It is real. They have a patch they wear on their uniforms.
Mhm.
Um, do they want that? Yes. Do I think President Trump is going to allow that to happen? Absolutely not. And I think what you're seeing is preventative measures for that. Like, Israel wants nothing more than to get into a war with Iran and drag us into it. And Trump's preemptive bombing of Iran took the wind right out of Israel's sail. Okay, it's done. You can't do that.
Oh,
And that was totally um, dumbfounding and completely unexpected to Israel. So Israel's Abraham Accord, or the US's Abraham Accords of basically doing a very quiet, I don't know if you know about the sword dance in Saudi Arabia and the MBS coming to power and all of the corrupt. So about 40 some princes got put in jail, and MBS ended up being in charge.
mm,
Every single one of those guys, I could tell you a story about, of the supplying money to ISIS and Al Qaeda with the CIA. They were in bed with the CIA. They were in bed in creating BCCI, a bank that was a CIA front bank that
you mean
laundered
the
all.
you mean the 40 prince? They were the one who funded this
They
ISIS.
were all bad.
Okay.
And so they were tied to all of the nefarious Adon Shikogi, the world's largest weapons trafficker, all of that. And so getting rid of them, and MBS being in charge of Saudi Arabia, changed everything in Saudi Arabia um, as far as their deep state is concerned. And so if you go around the different countries that collectively got together during Trump's first administration, Trump just signed an executive order with Qatar. That was another target, and Israel had already lobbed a bomb over into Qatar. Um, Trump signed an executive order that basically said, if you attack Qatar, you're attacking us and you're our enemy, which put Israel on notice. Do not do that, because they've sold the narrative forever that Qatar was a bad country. And you see all of the Israeli mouthpieces on X always talking about how bad Qatar is, where if that's not to say they didn't have a deep state, they did. And it's not to say they hadn't done bad things, but I believe, based on that executive order, that the agreement has been worked out. And what's interesting to me about Qatar is, if Qatar was all that bad, why, you know, 3 decades ago did we spend $1 billion to build CENTCOM's forward deployed headquarters in Qatar? We've been there. There's like 10,000 military people there. We've been there forever. Now, there was a CIA station there, which is where the missiles came from that was in Benghazi that caused Benghazi. And some of those same missiles were used to strike down our military aircraft in Afghanistan. And that was a big scandal. But of course, the CIA story is, oh, they must have gotten stolen. You don't steal missiles out of a CIA compound. You don't. And so they were over there trafficking weapons for nefarious purposes and got caught. And that was the whole thing, that Ambassador Stevens was sent over there to track down those missiles. And there was forces that didn't want him to do that, and they attacked the compound. So there are nefarious things, but I think what we see Trump doing is building a coalition of people that are going to stand up. And the more that coalition grows in the Middle East, the more isolated the government of Israel becomes.
On that note, I'm going to bring up Ukraine and probably link it to the we talk about this pre what we call pre-recorded interview. Um, I have a theory. I feel like what's going on in Ukraine right now is that, because you were saying about one world government and so on, and I do believe in it, and I do feel like the world is a stage. So I feel like what is going on in Ukraine is that Russia is clearing up the land in Ukraine. And what is going on in Israel right now with all the isolation and so on, I feel like they know they can't survive for long there. So I feel like there is probably a plan for them to migrate to Ukraine and go back to where they came from, the Khazarian civilization. And also, just recently I saw an article where Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff was on the negotiation table. I find that very weird because what is Jared Kushner doing there to begin with? And also, what is Steve Witkoff doing there, because he is the U.S. Special Envoy in the Middle East. Last time I checked, Ukraine is in Europe. So could it be that they are actually planning for the transfer of Israelis to southern Ukraine?
There's, as a matter of fact, Putin talks about a lot of the quote unquote Russians in Israel, because a lot of the settlement is Jewish people migrated to Israel. There is a lot of uh, ethnic Russian Jewish people in Israel. There is definitely a tie between um, Ukraine and Israel. Um, I have not speculated on exactly what that tie is, but um, if you look at what we do know about Ukraine and all of the nefarious activities they've been involved in, as far as the corruption goes, kind of my leading indicator of Ukraine was Ihor Kolomoisky. He is a ethnic um, uh, Jewish, Russian, Ukrainian. And in the immediate aftermath of the 2014 coup orchestrated by the CIA to overthrow their democratically elected government, um, Ihor Kolomoisky was installed as a governor along the Donbass region. And he's the one that hired the Azov battalion as his quote unquote National Guard, which is Nazis. Now, don't you find it really, really weird that a Jewish person would hire Nazis as their National Guard?
Yeah.
That's the thing that most people can't wrap their heads around. And of course, Zelensky's Jewish,
Mm.
and he activated the right sector and Azov and incorporated them into his army. So he literally has Nazis in very high positions within their army killing ethnic Russians. And the Russians that live in the Donbass region, which is primarily ethnic Russians, is being killed by Nazis, just like in World War II, controlled by Jewish people. It's the weirdest thing ever.
Yeah. I definitely feel like something really evil is going on in Ukraine, and I'm trying to spread as much to create as much awareness around it as well. And the guy that I don't know if you have watched that interview, but it was this guy named Igor Berkut, where he was the one who actually talked about this plan openly in an interview actually, and it's amazing how many of his prediction is looking like it's coming true. Also, maybe last question. Um, what is your opinion on Illuminati? Do you think they are really a satanic group or not?
So, if the Illuminati is probably a name that is very synonymous with what I refer to the international syndicate, the people in control of this one world government thing. And again, not using those types of terms, which at the beginning of this, because I was brand new to all of this information, there's a lot of terms. They call it the cabal, they call it whatever. I didn't feel like, because it's a criminal syndicate. That's what it is. They're doing all of these evil things, and they really don't care about how many people die. That in and of itself is satanic. If you have no value of human life at all, and you're willing to do child trafficking, and if you're willing to cut off kids' body parts, all of it's satanic. Bald being the kind of unisex thing. It's all paganistic, satanic, ritualistic overtures to, and it's a religion with them. So I don't think you can get away with not thinking there's some satanic link to it all. But if you go back to, I mentioned earlier, the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society were very much into the satanic type um, overtures. Whether it was the creation of the eugenics movement can be directly traced to them. So the overall kind of death cult nature of these operations, where, like I was saying, in Indonesia, 1 million people died. In Vietnam, in Cambodia, we overthrew the Cambodian government and millions died. The fact that they orchestrate these large scale wars like we did in Korea, they had stay behind units in Korea too. That's what prompted the Korean War. So the fact that you have the kind of like this black plague everywhere these entities go, and they're into torture. They've orchestrated all types of torture. You cannot do that unless you're possessed by some satanic evil entity. So yes, I think it's very much satanic. I mean, the whole I don't know if you've ever heard of the Thule, I think was the name of it. That was the mysticism involved with the Nazis. Very weird kind of ceremonial tributes, all satanic in nature. So you definitely have to consider that. and understand that there is a satanic force that is woven through all of this because it's like a death cult.
Mhm. Yeah, Albert Pike famously said that he wants three world wars and to create
Yes.
one world government and so on. They're trying to say that it is actually uh what do we call fake. It is a somebody created that speech when it never happens and so on. It was what we call a prank by this French journalist. But I don't know. I feel like
Well, the
it's.
Fabian Society was very famous for saying they wanted three world wars. They said the exact same thing, and they said one world government
Mhm.
in their own words.
And this Fabian Society, are they like a branch of Freemason, Illuminati, or is it a separate entity?
It's really a separate entity. They overlap, though,
Oh,
in membership. And that's kind of something that I found very interesting going back to Italy and their Gladio. They hid in a Masonic lodge called P2. It was Propaganda Duo. Um, and the only other P2 lodge branch was in Argentina, which is where Operation Condor started, where we overthrew, like seven governments in Latin America. So there is a Masonic element to it. One of the things we didn't talk about is the Vatican Church. All of the people that were part of the P2 lodge,
mm,
most of the Vatican infrastructure was also part of the P2 lodge. And in the Catholic Church, you're not allowed to be a Mason. So how did that happen? And you have the Knights of Malta. Almost every CIA director for a large span of time was a member of the Knights of Malta. It just gave them another venue to meet in and do planning and stuff like that under the guise of some religious order. The Vatican Church, in Paul Williams' book called Operation Gladio, was the first during the Paul Helliwell time frame with Chiang Kai-shek. They money laundered all of the drug money for the CIA.
mm,
The Vatican Bank, the sovereign within a sovereign, was the chief money launderer. And it got so big that they had to create some of the other fake banks, like the one in Australia called Nugent Hand, and one that was set up in London called BCCI by a Pakistani guy. But they were all part of that organization, and the lodge is an intricate part of it. So they overlap in many different ways.
mm. I always wonder why nobody is making a big fuss about the Vatican being. I mean, like their finances are very kept hidden from the public.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, and it's the perfect place to money launder.
Yeah. Okay, Colonel. Thank you so much for being here. I feel like I learned a lot of stuff from you. Definitely will help my research to connect the dots and so on. Okay.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Okay.